Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Just a little bit of information about this event. Some of you may have joined us last week, in which Dr. Matchek and Michael Van Beek presented on vaccine mandates and liberty. This week is going to be formatted a little bit differently. This will be more of a roundtable discussion as well as giving some information about how to conduct research, where to find sources. This really is to help those college and high school students who are participating in our essay competition. They will be writing on vaccine mandates and liberty. And so, as I mentioned, this form is really focusing on where and how do we go about finding reliable scholarly sources. We are joined today by Michael Van Beek. Mike Van Beek is the Director of Research for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, which is a free market think tank located right here in Midland. He has authored several studies for the center, as well as analysis and commentaries that have been published in national and state-based outlets. He is also most recently the author of a study focused on the 1945 Emergency Powers Act, which was cited by the Michigan Supreme Court. Dr. Dale Matchek is a professor and chair of the economics department at Northwood University. He is co-author and editor of When We Are Free, an anthology of essays describing the values and functioning of a free enterprise system. He is a member of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy Studies Board of Scholars and regular participant in educational seminars for the Institute of Humane Studies and the Foundation of Economic Education. We are also joined this evening by Andrew Reeder. Andrew is an honors student at Northwood University, majoring in economics. As a former homeschooler, Andrew now leads several student initiatives for free enterprise policy and serves in leadership positions at Northwood, such as Turning Point USA. In December 2021, Andrew's free enterprise activism led him to be appointed as student director for the Northwood Idea at the Northwood Idea Center. Now, bear in mind, for those of you who are tuning in for the essay competition, just a few things to be aware of. The timeline is up on the screen. March 13th is when registration is due. Essays are due by March 20th, and the first week of April, the winners will be announced. There will be cash prizes in two separate competitions. One for college students, particularly Northwood University undergrad and DeVos graduate school students. And then a second essay competition will be among high school students across the state of Michigan, as well as some international students who have elected to participate. As mentioned, there are cash prizes, and there is a handout that's right on the table as you walk out of here. If you'd like to get more information about the requirements for this particular project, you can see the handout or talk to Dr. G after the event. Now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to lead you in a discussion of vaccine mandates and liberty. Where do we find scholarly research?
Thanks everyone for being here, and welcome to the crowd that's joining us online. My name is Mike Van Beek. Thanks, Holly, for the introduction. Before we start the roundtable discussion, I wanted to highlight a couple of things and give a demonstration on how to think about analyzing a source. I realize, this is difficult to explain exactly how to look for and to filter out information when you're doing this kind of research. So what I'm going to talk about mainly is one of the points that's on this sheet. This is available at the back, and it's on the website as well for the essay contest. And it provides some general advice on how to do research and how to look for good sources. And what I want to talk about here is the importance of understanding the nuance and the details and focusing on those when you're doing this kind of research and when you're writing a paper. So a framework for how to kind of think through some of these things. You need to think about very specific questions and try to answer those questions and help and allow those answers to guide where your essay is going to go. This will also help inform you of what good sources look like. So The topic for this is vaccine mandates and personal liberty. Where do we draw the line? So think about what is the objective of a vaccine mandate. That seems like an easy question maybe because it's protect public health. That's primarily the goal of those kinds of policies. But how much should it protect public health? How much must it protect public health? What types of diseases must it protect public health from? Any kind of disease. There's there's variations with different types of diseases. They present different risks, different threats to the public. So be very specific about and think about what types of benefits need to be provided to public health. Also, what must the vaccine accomplish? What are the characteristics of the vaccine to achieve that objective? So obviously, we would all say probably that a vaccine must be safe in order to be mandated. But how safe? How many people could be harmed? To how many people are protected? What's that ratio? What's the acceptable ratio? We want the vaccine to be trusted, right? So what standards of trust must be met? How transparent must the development of the vaccine be? How many tests must it undergo? How many clinical trials must it pass? What about the effectiveness? Vaccines aren't 100% effective. No vaccine is. So it's a spectrum. Must it be 99% effective or 90% effective, 75%, 50%? Think about those kinds of details when you're looking at research and writing this essay. And then, how reliable must the vaccine be? How long must it last? How long must it protect people? And then on the personal liberty side of things, think specifically about what liberties are at play here and which ones are important, which ones need to be protected, or which ones can be violated. Think about those specifically about different types of liberties, different types of freedoms, and then also why those particular ones, right? This is an oversight that a lot of people make when they write about liberty and freedom. It's a very general topic. It can be. I challenge you to be very specific. Explain why that particular freedom is important or that liberty is important. And then also think about when, just as there's no perfect vaccine and it's always on a spectrum, there's no liberty that can't be violated at times, right? So under what conditions could those liberties be violated? Think about that and answering that question might help with you developing your essay. And then I want to read through a couple of sources that I found online and just work through and explain how you might think about whether or not these are good sources and a good source for arguments that you might use in an essay like this. And these are just from a quick Google search that I did, and let me read them, and then I'll talk specifically about each one. So this one is on making the argument that vaccine mandates are ethical. It says people cite bodily integrity, personal liberty, and freedom as the most common justifications for refusing vaccines. But these arguments don't hold water. It's true that everyone has the right to refuse a medical intervention for their own good, but vaccines not only protect the person vaccinated, but also that person's family, neighbors, and classmates or coworkers. No one has the right to go into a crowded classroom or workplace unmasked and unvaccinated. Vaccine mandates do not unethically discriminate. Discrimination is wrong when it is based on irrational reasons or animus, such as discrimination based on race, gender, or disability. But vaccine mandates are a simple tool, and they apply equally to everyone. They don't impute blame or seek to shame the unvaccinated. They are intended only to keep the entire population safe. So, as you look at this kind of argument and consider using this as a source for the kind of essay that you might write, I'll point out a few limitations of this, a few shortcomings. In the first sentence, you notice This is about whether vaccine mandates are ethical. And the first sentence is about about justifications for refusing vaccines, which is slightly different than a vaccine mandate, right? This is actually talking about why an individual person might choose not to become vaccinated. That is actually different than having a government policy where everyone has to be vaccinated. So be careful of that, where this is not specific enough or not specific to the topic. Later, it says vaccines not only protect the person vaccinated, but also the person's family, neighbors, and classmates or coworkers. Here, I think the author is lumping together all vaccines and kind of overgeneralizing. Not all vaccines stop transmission of a virus. That's the case with the COVID-19 vaccines that we have so far. So this is not specific about COVID-19 vaccines and is talking in more general terms and probably too general of a terms to be helpful here. It also says vaccine mandates do not unethically discriminate. Again, a little bit off the topic here. That's not really one of the reasons why people argue against vaccine mandates, at least not one that I'm aware of that people say they needlessly discriminate. They, of course, apply equally because they're mandates. And then the last sentence I want to just pull out here is the author writes that they are intended only to keep the entire population safe. Again, this is not making a specific case for why a vaccine mandate would be ethical. This is just stating the intention of a policy, and just defining the intention of a policy is not really a good argument for it specifically. Now I'm going to show one from the other side of the spectrum where this one is opposed to a vaccine mandate, as you'll pick up right away. It reads, top-down vaccine mandates are wrong and ineffective. We must have a limited federal government that doesn't mandate personal health care choices for everyday Americans. I made the personal choice to get vaccinated, and I think these vaccines are effective at combating the COVID-19 pandemic. I also think that people's personal choices must be respected. Sadly, Joe Biden is once again abusing the power of the executive branch. The American people should be given the scientific information they need to assess the risk to themselves and their families, and then they can freely make their choice. Americans must reject this unprecedented mandate. So what I want to highlight here with this one is we again have a very broad general perspective with few details. We must have a limited federal government that doesn't mandate personal health care choices for everyday Americans. And the first sentence, of course, just says vaccine mandates altogether are wrong and ineffective. This makes it a little bit difficult to understand if this is an argument specifically about COVID-19 vaccine mandates or about laws related to vaccines in general. There are a lot of laws that require people to get vaccines. So this person is it's unclear if they're talking specifically about COVID-19 or not. So it's not as helpful. And then the sentence in here too about President Biden also should raise a bit of a red flag, because this person is using this to make a political argument. It's a partisan approach, and that is not necessarily helpful. And I would avoid sources that do that, and try to focus on ones where the author tries to present an equal case for each side, or at least give the other side a fair look. So with that, I wanted to just highlight some of those, a way for you to think about doing the research and the writing for this essay, and then give kind of an example of how you might analyze some of the different sources that you're going to read. There's a lot of information out there on this issue right now. One thing that I found helpful is to look at information that was published before COVID-19, because that's often very different. It wasn't as politically charged in those years, and so that information in a lot of ways is is more helpful than a lot of the stuff that is being published or has been published recently because it's so politically charged. So I look forward to hearing what my other panelists, their thoughts as well.
Well, I'd like to add to that and just kind of say that really you can learn a lot about a source from the author and from whether or not it's been peer reviewed. And if something has not been peer reviewed, that should likely be peer reviewed. So if an academic journal not gone through the peer review process, that's a red flag. I think that when you look at the author, you should examine, does the author display his credentials right off the bat? If an author does not show his credentials right away, that's a red flag. I think that if you go on, he has his credentials out there, you should see who he's affiliated with. If he's affiliated with a university or a research institute or a nonprofit research center such as that, I think that that's a good green light to keep going. And certainly, if he's ever affiliated with any sort of political institution, any sort of public action group, that should be thrown out right away. This is not an argumentative paper. This should be a scholarly research paper. You can make a point in the paper, but we're not winning elections with this paper. That's what I'd like to say. And so as soon as you see anybody being even remotely a snide comment against any official, anybody, okay, that's not an academic paper. That's not a reliable source. And they say that if somebody tells one lie, how do you know what else they said true, right? So, and then lastly, I think you should look at the content, and if something is under 10 pages long, I often question it. That's my own personal thing. I don't know if that's always true. I don't know if you found that to be true or if you found that to be true. But generally, if someone has made something that's over 10 pages long, I like to say that they put a lot of real work into it.
Yeah, I'd say it's a pretty good standard. But I would say too that I think people can definitely create good material that is less than 10 pages long. I think that's probably a good shortcut in a way of understanding, of judging whether or not the issue is dealt with thoroughly. So, like a few of the quotations I read, right? These were not from 10-page papers. These were very short snippets of information. They didn't provide much detail, and so they were weak in that sense. So I think that is a good guideline, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be a hard and fast rule.
Well, I've used sources that were shorter than that, but I like to use that as a guide. But yeah, and one thing that I was going to say that you've already kind of mentioned was pre-COVID, you'll find a lot more real research. And so I found a really good research study from, I believe it was Johns Hopkins in 2018, that surveyed medical students in graduate school and what they thought about vaccines. And then you see the numbers jump drastically as soon as the COVID pandemic hit and as soon as vaccines are politicized. It's so very difficult that even an academic paper that may have come from a government institution, it's much harder to believe it now than it ever was before. So if you can at all find information pre-COVID, go with that before you do post-COVID, especially if they conflict with each other.
Okay, so I'm going to push back against this idea of going back in time. There's at least one area of research which is getting better over time, and that's the medical research. And since it takes time to run clinical trials and things like that, you probably want to look for the most recent research as far as clinical trials. And I also would recommend that you don't limit yourself to U.S. sources. In fact, I think some of the most interesting stuff is coming out of Israel and Denmark and places like that. I would use the Center for Disease Control, Johns Hopkins University, and other places like that that everybody uses. But I'm kind of digressing a little bit here. I wanted to give you some insight into the way I approach the writing process. Take what might work for you. As far as I can tell, the thing that's going to help your paper as much as anything is your credibility. So that's something you really have to be careful about. And I think my colleagues here have spoken to that. The way you choose your sources, the way you word your arguments can make or break your credibility. So there are a few things that you can do to protect your credibility. Number one, make sure that you understand arguments on both sides. And the way that your reader knows that you understand them is because you can actually describe them. Okay, so don't just pick one point of view and defend that. Even if you've got really great information and great arguments, it hurts your credibility. So I would definitely say try to look at both sides of the debate. And not just from critics on both, one side. Look at the original sources. The other thing I would do to correct, Andrew mentioned it, the peer-reviewed articles, the ones that are 10 pages long. Well, I probably wouldn't read a 10-page article for this, at least not the whole thing. So what I have found is that a lot of the 10-page articles will be cited in smaller articles, shorter articles. And you can go to the 10-page article following a link, be sure that it exists, it's published, and so forth, but you don't necessarily need, and I don't know if you read it either, right?
No, not the whole thing.
So usually I will read abstracts of those 10-page articles. I won't read the whole thing. I'll read the abstract. And that usually contains enough information that I can get the essence of the article. Another thing, I don't use Google. And if I do use Google, I use page 2. Because the first page is, what either Google wants you to see or what is most popular, which is not necessarily what you're looking for. Especially now that after doing a little bit of research for my speech last week, I find that if you're looking for balance from a front page of Google, it's just not there. So I use Google Scholar, and you can easily get to Google Scholar. I don't know how many of you use Google Scholar. So I don't see a lot of hands up. If you don't use Google Scholar, that's what you should be using on any academic work, because that takes you to the peer-reviewed research and eliminates a lot of the other stuff. Okay, so you get to Google Scholar, just type Google Scholar in Google, they'll take you to the web page, then start using that as your search engine. When it comes to sources, I would echo what my colleagues up here have already said about the reliability of it. And I would also suggest that you make use of your library, if you have access to one, and talk to the reference librarian. And sometimes the reference librarian can be a big help. I know here at Northwood, if you're a student here, our reference librarian, Rochelle Zimmerman, has a bunch of links collected and is ready to help you with your research on sources. Okay, my writing process. First of all, also my judging process, because sometimes I read student papers. I read a lot of student papers. I see some mistakes in student papers. I would say relying too much on one source or relying too much on two sources is a very common mistake. So I would like to see your papers use a variety of sources and none of them too much. So when I write a paper, I will typically take a sentence or two note on that paper, and I may end up using that or I may not use that. But I will typically at least have 20 sources for a paper of this length. And most of them I won't use in the paper itself, but I'm educating myself. And then I will put them, now I used to put these on index cards, these little notes. And then I would take that little note and I would write a paragraph on it in my own words. And I would make that paragraph as good and clear as I could make it, but it wouldn't be part of the paper. And I would do that for every source I used. And by the time I'm done, and this sounds time consuming, by the time it's done, you've got notes that are well-written notes on these sources. And then you can kind of shuffle them around, put them together. Your paper's already written. You just have to, put it together in a way that makes sense. So I find this is great for overcoming fear of a blank page. Students think, you can do a little chunk, right? Talk about a little piece. And then you don't start from a blank page. Then it's just rearranging what you've got. Another thing that I do is I never approach it from scratch. I always have a couple of tricks up my sleeve based on what I know. And I bet you guys start from what you know. And of course, what I know is economics. So there are a couple of economic principles I find are almost always helpful. One is the question, instead of what? You notice opportunity cost, or it's just a reminder, you're asking a question, should we have a vaccine mandate? Well, the other question, the implied question is instead of what? Right? Sometimes we talk about the vaccine mandate as if that's our only option. And I think it's useful to ask that question. Another principle that I always have in the back of my mind is there's no such thing as free lunch, which means there's always going to be a cost associated with anything that we attempt to do. And a third principle is the idea of unintended consequences. Always going to be unintended consequences. And a lot of the literature that I see on the COVID vaccine is the kind of literature that says, gosh, if we have a COVID vaccine, then everybody's going to take it. That's not true. If we have a COVID vaccine, there are a significant number of people who would rather quit their jobs than take the vaccine. And that is an example of unintended consequences. And in your research, you will find some indication of what kinds of unintended consequences this policy would have. So make sure that you include some of that discussion. Lots of surveys have been taken about unintended consequences. For example, nursing homes. You think if anybody gets the vaccine, it's workers in nursing homes, right? But nursing homes are already dealing with a severe shortage of labor right now. And surveys show that under a vaccine mandate, they would lose a significant share of the workers they already have, and that would put their residents at risk as well. So if they've got workers with natural immunity, that might be, for them, a more favorable. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you what to write. I'm just going to say policies have unintended consequences. That's something you can rely on. Another thing that I commonly use is the distinction between positive and normative economics. Positive economics deals with matters of fact, and I like to separate those out in my mind. What are the facts that we know? And then there are the matters of value. What value do we assign to them? And I always have three criteria that I typically look at when thinking about the value. One is efficiency. We can judge a policy based on its costs and benefits. You'll find lots of research on this in terms of what the economic benefits might be, what the costs might be. Another one is going to be equality. And equality can mean rich versus poor. So think about, how does this affect people who are rich compared to people who are poor? And not just that kind of equality, but how does it affect different groups, different types of workers? Young versus old is a really big example in this case, because the protection of a vaccine is much different based on ages, as well as the risks of the vaccine are much different based on age. And so, we're really talking about two different groups of people with very disparate effects with respect to the mandate. That's an example of what we call horizontal inequality, when a policy affects two different groups very differently. And a third criteria, which is the subject of the essay that's most important, is one of liberty. How does this affect liberty? Obviously, that's the purpose of your paper, to investigate how it affects liberty. But I always approach any paper I do with this idea, liberty, equality, efficiency. I don't necessarily expect that it's going to check all three of those boxes. But we might want to acknowledge that, it has this. If you value this, maybe this is something you want to support. If you value this, maybe it's something you want to oppose. And so people have different values. Bit of advice about your opening and your closing. Another thing I read in student papers, sometimes I feel like it's been written by a computer, because students were taught, here's what you say in your opening paragraph, and here's what you say in your closing paragraph, and it's usually something like, here's what I'm about to say, and here's what I said. And that's really, really boring. So if you want your essay to stand out, think about it like a song. Musician needs a hook, so you will actually be interested in hearing the rest of the song. There are lots of famous hooks in music, and it's just as important in an essay like this, especially if you're trying to stand out from the other essays. So if you can engage the reader's attention from the beginning, I would encourage you to do that. And I'm not going to tell you how to do that. That requires a little bit of creativity, and it requires that you know a little bit about your own strengths as a writer. And then one more thing, just the writing process, get that rough draft done, no matter how bad it is, okay? Don't use your rough draft for revising. After your rough draft is done, then you have time to revise it, okay? But I know lots of people get stuck trying to get their rough draft as if it's their final draft, and they spend way too much time on the beginning. Don't do that. Get something on paper, no matter how bad it is. And then, if you're stuck, that part, go to the next part, get it done. Then work on the revision. If you're stuck on a part, let it go. Show it to a friend. Ask them or her what they think. Just don't get stuck. Don't get stuck. So those are my ideas. Now I think we're going to open it up to. Did you have something to say, Michael?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you two a question, because I've thought about this in thinking about this essay contest, is sources, ranking sources. So both of you mentioned different, peer-reviewed as kind of being the highest standard. I think that's true that the best quality research has been peer-reviewed in a robust and transparent way. But it's also true that there's a lot of garbage that gets peer-reviewed. We've seen this, right? People have gotten fake papers printed in what is supposed to be prestigious journals that was supposed to be peer-reviewed, and it just never happens, or it didn't happen in that case. So you even have to be careful with peer-reviewed papers in some way. Really, there's no way around you have to do hard work here. You have to go and look at the sources that the article is referring to. You have to click the links and go check them out to make sure they actually say what the author says they are saying. But I wanted, so that might be the highest level of peer review. How would you rank some of the other types of sources that you might find? So there's government data, blogs, media, articles from newspapers or online media. How would you rank some of those other things?
I would rank them pretty high. I think they can be really quick and useful, and especially if I trust a person, because they've been a reliable source in the past. So, for example, I trust John Tierney, who was a science writer for the New York Times for a long time, and he now writes for City Journal. and I read what he publishes. There's some other people that I trust, and I think the Mackinac Center puts out good stuff.
Yep.
I think they're a reliable source, and they have high standards. So if the source has a reputation, then I think that can be a very useful resource. And so there are a number of those that I go to.
Yeah, because you can find online a lot of sources that appear to be for professional or official in some sense or authoritative, but they might not have any sort of reputation. I think this is one of the things you mentioned, Andrew, of making sure they have attribution of some kind. If it's an article that no one is willing to sort of put their name on, or no organization is willing to embrace, that's probably something that you should approach with skepticism, I would say. Not to say that it has to be incorrect or shouldn't be used at all, but if you don't have an author identified, or if the organization or if the website doesn't have a clear definition of who runs the website and what this organization is about and what it does and who's on the board and what they're all about, I would be skeptical of those kinds of stories.
Yeah, you're not going to use an anonymous letter to the editor. I think it's important not to go out looking for something. So if you're looking for a specific data to make your specific point, you will be highly susceptible to overlooking these red flags we brought up.
Yeah, that's good.
So, and it's true. I mean, just because something's peer-reviewed doesn't mean it's going to be good. And so just because something's 10 pages long doesn't mean it's going to be good. I could write 10 pages about anything. You know what I mean? It could be garbage. I think you should try to check a lot of the boxes, but not all of them. And just make sure that you're unbiased, so that way you can find the biased information.
Great. Thank you to our panelists for an engaging discussion. We are now going to open it up to Q&A. Audience members, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll be around to provide cards and pens that you can jot that question down. For those of you tuning in online, we will try to get to your questions if you can drop it in the chat. Just to get us started, what are some ways that people can check their own biases when reading, whether it be scholarly research, a newspaper article? How can we know what is just confirming our bias, or if there is something that's still trustworthy?
One of the things that I do is I seek out sources that I know will challenge my position I have, sort of the leaning that I have going into a policy debate or a policy discussion. I don't know how easy that is to do, but for people. But I like to go and read the counter arguments to where my natural inclinations are, and I find that makes the arguments that I end up making better. I've found that it's changed my mind on certain things. And so I would start that way. Whichever way you kind of lean on the issue, start with reading the other side of it, and go from there. And it will strengthen the arguments that you end up with, I think. And it may change your mind and persuade you to pursue a line of reasoning that you weren't inclined to naturally.
And I want to reinforce that with a story about Abraham Lincoln, if I could. When he was preparing to run for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, his law partner suggested, well, we need to subscribe to some anti-slavery newspapers so you can get ready for this. And he said, no, we need to subscribe to some pro-slavery Southern newspapers so I can get ready for this. And Lincoln's arguments were original with him, not borrowed, because he studied primarily his opponents. and not his allies.
He knew what his views were, right? He didn't need. It was more important for him to know what his opponent's views were.
Right.
And I want to reinforce what you said too, Andrew, about keeping an open mind from the beginning. Don't start with your conclusion and then find your sources to justify it. Start with your sources and then use that to justify your conclusion.
Would you consider government sources to be trustworthy? I know you mentioned the CDC a little earlier, but then obviously there are a wide array of government sources from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is primarily a numbers game, versus general information. How do you discern what is reliable and trustworthy versus what is not when it comes from the U.S. government?
Well, I don't consider it. I think the CDC is pretty good, but I don't consider it to be objective. What I have discovered is the health information put out by other countries is a little more nuanced and a little more different. So, for example, when it comes to vaccines, I love what Denmark, the public health bulletins that Denmark puts out, which, they come right out and say it, there's a risk to taking this vaccine. And I just don't see that from government sources. The value of natural immunity, things like that, I think you'll find them if you look for them in our government sources, but they're not where you're going to find them without. So it's clear that CDC has an agenda, in my opinion. Doesn't mean it doesn't have good information. It does. But, it's a way of publishing and arranging the information so that what you see is processed in a certain way. Yeah, I think I would go beyond government sources, at least beyond U.S. government sources right now.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, to recognize that government sources, government agencies are fundamentally political in nature. They have to be. So I've been doing public policy research for the last 12 years, and I've seen different government data under different presidents and different parties, and you can tell who is in charge in the White House based on how the data that comes out of government agencies is presented, because it is presented in a way that is politically favorable to whoever is in charge of the government. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be objective or that it's not good data or that it can't be good analysis, but you should keep that in mind. And again, you have to do the hard work. There are some government databases that are a lot better than other government databases. So keep that in mind. And Professor Matchek was talking about the CDC. There's a great article that a few days ago in the New York Times where the CDC where the New York Times was pointing out that the CDC has data that they've been collecting about COVID-19 and about COVID-19 vaccines that they just haven't released to the public. They've left it, they've kept it hidden because they are fearful it will be misinterpreted. So I think that is a good demonstration that while government databases can be really good and good sources of information, they're definitely not everything. And there are political elements to how they operate.
I think what I'm hearing from both of you and what I would say is we can't go into a conspiracy game where they make their numbers up. But I do think that they can present it in a way, or they can withhold some numbers, or maybe give you numbers that you may not even need, just to make their point. And so I'd say that I wouldn't ban it from your research, but I like what Dr. Matchek says when he says you could look at other nations and compare what they say.
Dr. Matchek, you mentioned you find Google Scholar to be fairly useful. Are there any other scholarly databases that you would recommend, JSTOR or something of that nature?
Well, if you've got a library that has access to, Northwood does have access to JSTOR. In fact, this is a weakness of the peer-reviewed journal. It is great if you're going to go back, before COVID era, but a lot of the stuff that's coming out now, peer review process does take time. And so the journals that have been published, they don't necessarily have most recent information. So it depends on the kind of thing you're looking for. Google Scholar will have working papers, other things like that, that are kind of the journal article, 12 months before the journal was published. And I would say that even blogs are working papers before the working papers exist. You'll see a lot of professionals who are actually in real time putting their thoughts together. So there are certain blogs that I do review regularly, almost daily, and I think they can be a good source. Obviously, they haven't been through the peer review process, but they let me see what people are thinking or discovering in real time. It depends on the issue, of course.
When it comes to blogs, things that you read daily, what are your go-to sources? This question's open to any of you.
Feel some of my biases. Well, this is not just on this particular issue, but these are things I read. Marginal Revolution, which is a blog put together by a couple of economists from George Mason University. One of them, Alex Tabarrok, has been incredibly involved with public health issues for a long time, and incredibly involved from the very beginning, from the early stages, with studying the problem of COVID, and especially public policy related to COVID. So if Alex Tabarrok is writing anything, I will usually try to pay attention to that. He also has the ability to cross political divide with the things that he writes and talks about. So he's got credibility as an authority that's recognized by left and right. So Marginal Revolution is a good source. And then in general, some of the blogs that I read, I like City Journal. That's the blog of the Manhattan Institute. And I like, I think it's called Econ Log, which is a blog with numerous authors. That's, I can't remember who puts it out, but it's Econ Log.
Liberty Fund?
Is it Liberty Fund?
I think so, yeah.
So that's my bias. Now you can obviously tell I haven't included Huffington Post or anything like that, but I suppose I should be looking at that too.
Well, I think it's important to look at a variety of sources. So those are some professional, I call those professional blogs, right? These are professional economists who are writing blogs. So they have credentials and they have skills to do this kind of research, to analyze public policy, analyze costs and benefits. And but there's also, there's good sources in media, in newspapers, in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. There's a wide variety of them, but those too also have different levels of quality, and even within them have different levels of quality of the particular author of the piece. So again, my theme that I'm reiterating that I didn't even intend to is you have to do the hard work. You have to go in and click the sources and investigate where it came from, and what the actual support for the argument, where that actually lies.
Yeah, I like that. Often I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I very rarely would cite the Wall Street Journal, but a lot of times you can find good sources within the articles from what they have cited. Where they got their information, you can go to there. So that's always been very useful.
I will say, for my own purpose, I love opening up the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times and just comparing what headlines they have for the day. It's really interesting to see which outlets are focusing on different current events, and you get kind of a better perspective from that. Do you have any tips on how to evaluate whether a source is being funded by an interest group or has a particular agenda? That's a question from one of our online viewers.
I look at the About Us page on websites. There was actually, just today, a colleague of mine sent me an email to a group of my colleagues, and it was an article about something related to vaccine mandates, actually, and said, what do you think of this? And one of my colleagues quickly responded back and said, I don't think this is a very good source, and the reason is because they went to the About Us page and discovered that no names listed. It just gave a very general description of what the blog and organization is about, and said this is probably not a very reliable source because is nothing more. This could be just one person's blog post or one person's blog. They're not willing to put their name on it or stake their reputation on what is written here or anything like that. So that's what I do. I check the About Us page, and really, there are a lot of times where you can, if you read carefully what the source is saying, you can kind of between the lines there, you can pick up on what the agenda might be or what the slant might be of the piece. And I think one of the telltale signs is, do they give a fair treatment of the other side of the argument that they're talking about? So if it's a vaccine if it's an argument for vaccine mandates, do they give a fair shake to people who are opposed to vaccine mandates, and then vice versa on the other side? So I look at those few things, and you can't always tell right away. People are good at disguising that. But if you do a little bit of an investigation and read between the lines a little bit, you can. It's possible to detect that.
I like to say that if someone has credentials or if a publisher has credentials, they're going to show them. I mean, I'm not going to publish a piece with the McNair Center and not say that I'm a McNair scholar.
Yeah.
Would you say that videos or news stations are reliable sources of information?
Yeah, I'd say they can be, certainly. But I would probably rank them lower than an academic's blog or government website, and definitely below published peer-reviewed journal articles. But yeah, a good, well-balanced argument and well-resourced argument can be presented in a video format. That's totally possible. A lot of people who are good academics and good writers are taking to doing video blogs and those sorts of things. We'll find it easier to watch a video, listen to a podcast, that sort of thing, than read a 10-page paper. So it's definitely possible, but I would probably approach them with more skepticism than I would some of the other sources that we've already mentioned.
Yeah, I would just find them harder to use.
Yeah.
It takes longer to watch a video than it does to read an article, and you have less opportunity, I think, to really zero in on whatever it is in the video that you're interested in. So to me, it's just a matter of efficiency. I wouldn't use videos just because I don't have time. And you can always find what you're looking for, I think, in a more user-friendly in print.
Yeah, even with video, you should be able to identify whether the information that is provided is well sourced. So they should talk about where the information came from and be able to provide detailed information as well.
I would also add, I think of video as kind of a jumping off point, especially if you're talking about news stations. Those are short 5 to 10 minute hit segments. They're only going to cover the surface of information. They have their talking points, but you can use that to maybe be directed to their source. Or, if there is a guest on there that's talking about the information you're interested in, searching them and finding some of their writings. I think that that's always a good step. All right, well, thank you, guys. You have provided a wealth of information for our college students and high school students who will be working on these essays. Just a few last-minute remarks as we close up. Just a reminder that the essays are due on March 20th. That is for both the college and the high school. There is a 1,500 minimum word count for both of those essays. Once again, there are flyers in the back that you can visit. And a link online. And any questions you have can be sent to Professor John G. He can be reached at ideascenter@northwood.edu. Once again, that's ideascenter@northwood.edu. Also, for those of you here who are either incoming college students or current college students, I'd like to just take a moment and tell you about the Mackinac Center for Public Policy's internship program. Each year, we have nearly a dozen interns working in a variety of fields, from communications to our different policy areas, education, labor, transparency. And then we also have internships available for those who are interested in learning more about the world of fundraising or even events. If you are interested in these, they are full-time internships that last from May until August, and we have some information at our publications table. You can pick up a brochure, or feel free to ask any of our staff members that are here tonight if you have any questions. We also have some of our interns here in the room who I'm sure would be more than happy to tell you about their experience. Oh, wait, we have one more. Great, guys. Last but certainly not least, do you have any suggestions for those who may have not written an essay before?
Start soon. Start now.
You should read essays like this that have already been written. Yeah, especially if you're not familiar with what we're going to be looking for, judging criteria. There are plenty of examples, I'm sure, that you can find online of an essay that's already been published like this.
I know we have last year's essays. They were published on the Mackinac Center website. So if you go and search Bauervik essay, there should be an article that talks about last year's winners and also links to their individual essays. So that may be a great starting point, just so you have a framework for what the judges are looking for.
And if you're not already familiar with APA, I know that that's not a strict requirement for the high school competition, and I assume that all college students have already written an essay. But it's very easy to find information on how to basically structure your paper, how to cite it, and if you want more information, you can come and see me afterwards.
Okay, let's give our panelists one final round of applause. Again, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. Feel free to pick up any of the publications at the table, and as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, feel free to come talk to our speakers. Thank you.